the Nine Club always starts with like, and we're back or whatever, you know, what's his name spiel. And so I think I used to say, oh, and we're back with BS with TGs, you know, with da-da-da-da. And then so he started saying that. I'm like, fuck, what's my intro? So now I'm like, fuck an intro. This is Jeremy Fish. You know who the motherfucker is. I want to go start with just all the way back, like very beginnings with skating, because I don't know that history in Albany, correct?
Yeah, that's where I was born.
Yeah, and so just real quick, like how did you get into skating, and then who was your crew?
I got into skateboarding in junior high. It was really popular in that part of upstate New York. I was born in Albany, but I grew up in a small city called Saratoga Springs, which is a little further north.
What year did you start skating?
I was 13, and now I'm 44, and I'm still really bad at math.
Do the math?
Yeah.
31 years ago?
I got a Santa Cruz Jammer off a kid in my neighborhood who like bought it, got into it for 11 minutes, and got out of it.
Yeah.
And like I said, I grew up in this city where it was really popular for whatever reason. Saratoga Springs built a civic park in the 80s, and it actually is still open to this day, and is the longest continuous running skate park in the state of New York, which I don't know if anyone cares.
Public?
Yeah.
Oh wow. True.
Yeah, it's in a big recreation field with like pinched between like a baseball stadium and a football field. But yeah, I was really lucky because in that part of the country at that time, I mean, you know, it was popular and it was growing.
Sure.
But we had this really unusual island of skateboarding in upstate New York where a lot of really big dudes came out of there. Kenny Reed is probably our most successful pro from that neck of the woods, and Johnny Shularef owns one of the biggest skateboard companies in the world. And it was just kind of a list of dudes like that came out of this really small niche at a time where, like I said, for us to have had a skateboard park, I mean, we were dead middle between Manhattan and Montreal, which means terrible winters. I mean, almost as bad as they get.
Oh yeah.
And so for us to have had that and that scene in a place that was like covered in shit weather for, 4 months a year was pretty special.
Oh yeah, for sure.
But it wasn't special enough because it had bad weather, and I at some point got an opportunity to go to art school and borrow a bunch of money and pursue my education/art. But at that time, I was way more interested in Thrasher and like dudes like you and things that made this place more attractive than where I was, mostly because it had a lot of hills and not a lot of snow. So I got into SVA in New York and the Boston Museum School in Boston, but they still had bad weather and not a lot of big hills. So I got into the San Francisco Art Institute, which is just down the street, and the oldest fine arts institution on the West Coast. And they put Barry McGee on the cover of the catalog. Like amazing. A lot of things that made me want to move here all at once. 93, 94 was like a really special time for San Francisco, and I was watching very carefully from 3,000 miles away, and I borrowed a bunch of money and showed up.
So when you're, going back in Albany, what did you guys skate? So you had a skate park and you had your crew. Like, who was the best out of your crew?
Rick Marr, actually.
Yeah. Rick, that's right, Rick, I forgot.
Rick Marr, Kenny Reed probably were the two best guys out of anybody I know. This guy named Phil Latch out of my circle, but they were like the older sponsored guys, Blake Hannon, Jeff Toma, Johnny Shularef, Carl Schultz, eventually Kenny, but he was like more my age and in my circle of friends. It was unusual for a place like that to have like sponsored guys and like older guys, and like it just had a huge scene for being pretty isolated in the Northeast. I mean, it's something when you're that age, you don't really recognize it. But once I got 3,000 miles away and sort of met other guys from similar circumstances from around the country and around the world, I started to realize like, holy shit, where I'm from is actually like pretty sick, and you don't know it when you're back there and you're a disgruntled teenager because it snows too much. And the city I grew up in had the park and didn't have a lot of good street skating, which in the mid-90s was kind of what I was into. Albany did, but I didn't drive, and it was like half an hour away. And so I got very spoiled when I got here because suddenly everything I'd always wanted in Thrasher was like right in front of me. And going to art school was a bit of a challenge because I was mostly skateboarding at that age.
Yeah, actually showing up to go to class.
Yeah, no, and I took school seriously and got good grades, but I think a lot of art school is like networking and getting to know these other artists and like going to school functions, and I was just so really wanted to be better at skateboarding at that age and didn't come here to pursue it like I thought I was gonna do anything with it. I was already 19 when I got here. I just really wanted to like use my knees and hips to the fullest before I couldn't, And I think gravity and hill bombing here was like something I had never experienced. There's a little bit of that in Albany, but not like this.
No, there's nowhere like this.
And at that age, it was literally like my favorite thing to do. But I graduated from art school, and mostly, like I said, I had a resume and spots that I'd skated. Like I didn't interact maybe in art school as best I should. I majored in screen printing because I knew my dad was really serious. He's like, you can go to a fine art school, you take out all these loans, you can go where the fuck you want, but take something that has like a practical application and that you can actually get a job doing.
Smart.
And I knew how to screen print. Guy in my neighborhood as a kid had the contract in the 80s for Ben & Jerry's. And so he'd hire a bunch of neighborhood kids to screen print one-color shirts. So I knew about screen printing through him. I also used to print t-shirts for like my circle of friends and I when we were younger. And so I took screen printing, I majored in it. Through that, I met a kid who worked in a wallpaper factory in the Mission. And I got a job working there that paid better than anyone else. You know, like I worked as a janitor at my school. I worked at Copeland's on Market Street. But this wallpaper gig was like, you know, sick-ass job to be in college and getting paid like a grown-ass man.
Yeah.
And yeah, so my life was basically go to school, print wallpaper, and go skateboarding.
So you were printing wallpaper? Mm-hmm. Ah, that's amazing.
Yeah, it was like the company, I think in its infancy, probably printed large-scale volume of wallpaper for shit all over the world. By the time I worked there in the 90s, it was mainly for like casinos and rich homes that had had some kind of damage, you know, water or fire damage, where they needed to replace like a section of a room. So they'd send us a scrap of like 40-year-old wallpaper, and we'd have to reproduce it and print textures over it to make it look aged.
So is that where your Illustrator skills came in?
Not yet.
Not yet.
No, and I ignorantly didn't take any illustration in college. The Art Institute doesn't even offer it. I mean, I took painting and screen printing and wanted to be some sort of painter, and took screen printing because little by little my art started to make more sense in screen printing, and little by little I started doing more drawing and less painting. But again, mainly because I knew I could go and get some kind of paying gig and could pursue my art in balance with it.
Yeah.
And this is where the story gets fucking awesome. So while skateboarding home from the wallpaper company.
What year was this?
96, probably. I met a guy named Dustin Wingreen who already worked for Fausto and Eric, which is, you know, the gentleman behind Thrasher and Deluxe and all these companies I wanted to be a part of. And he worked at the screen printing facility that printed all the shit for these companies I admired.
Print Town.
Mm-hmm. His boss suddenly up and quit. He got handed the reins of this company at like 24 years old. And I graduated from school like all in the same 2 weeks or month. And Dustin hired me to be his assistant. So I went from like studying screen printing and printing wallpaper and thinking I had this very good luck finding a job with that kind of career thing going on.
Yeah.
And the next thing you know, I was working in the skateboard industry doing something I had like beyond my wildest dreams, overseeing every single board, every single t-shirt, every single
printing
poster.
All the Thrasher shirts,
all the stickers, yeah.
That's
It was
insane.
like, it was run by me, a guy named Dustin Wingreen, and a guy named Dwayne Lant. And it ran 24 hours a day at certain points, unless we were slow, printing hundreds and sometimes thousands of skateboards a week. All the t-shirts for Thrasher, Deluxe, Spitfire, which at the time was the huge breadwinner with all those crazy sleeve prints and things that were all fairly progressive in the t-shirt printing world.
Yeah.
And stickers and flat work, like posters and things like that for Juxtapose. This was like cutting edge screen printing that we had some of the best equipment and some of the best printers in California. My job was genuinely to check the films and make sure everything would register, and then watch the thing being printed and make sure it registered. The boards were curved, and that's a tricky surface to print consistently on, and you know the boards varied one to the next depending on where they were in the stack, and like it was a very and I cared, you know what I mean? Like I didn't want some kid getting it at some shop in Kansas and being like, oh, that shit's janky, like that Andy Roy with the snakes is gently out of register, like because I was that kid. You know, I hung out in the winter in the shop in my hometown and just fucking stared at that stuff and was like, I want to do that, you know? Little did I know doing that meant seeing it get printed well. In that, I was studying under the masters. You know, I was like grad school with Todd Francis, who at that time was questionably the best, and may still be, like one of the best dudes to ever decorate a skateboard.
Yeah.
And one of the best dudes, like as far as his personality and his willingness to share information and his sense of humor. And like, I came from this very fine arts background. I immediately jumped into a commercial arts career, and then I was studying under this dude who was just the master of his craft. And a lot of other people. I mean, we printed stuff for Juxtapose and when the magazine was brand new. And at this age, I was still skateboarding like a shitload. So I was like working in the sport and had a pretty good paying job. I was paying off my student loans. I had a great place to live. Met all these dudes I'd always looked up to and like made sure their shit came out sick. It was like, at that age, I really didn't think life was gonna get any better. I was like as happy as a guy in his early 20s out of art school could possibly be.
Insane.
And again, I came out here with absolutely zero hope of doing anything responsible at all. You know, it was like take out loans and pretty much probably ruin your financial life forever.
Yeah.
So needless to say, I owe that guy Dustin and Fausto and Eric infinitely, because had it not be for that job, I have no idea what I would be doing today. I got to do a Thrasher shirt in the late 90s, and I got to do a Juxtapose poster before anyone reading that magazine would have any idea who I am, just because I made sure their posters came out good, you know? Little by little, I was sneaking shit out there from the print shop just because I was nice to people and they let me. And slowly started doing boards for Think, like little by little.
That's right. What was your first board?
Keith Cochran, who is a wonderful man and changed my life just like Eric, Fausto, and Dustin. He's liked me. I don't think he liked my art. He just liked me as a dude. We had a really good interaction. He was a kind of abrasive guy at that time in his career, and like I liked it. Like I liked his whole style. I liked that he was out at night dancing and just being a crazy ass dude. Yeah. I liked the Venture ads where he had a microwave in his glove box driving around the Fillmore being bad. I just liked everything about him, and he genuinely had the same feelings towards me, and little by little he'd let me do stuff, and they were terrible. Like they were just awful board graphics. Even Todd and those guys who were my friends and like trying to help me, I'd see him come into the print shop and just look at these boards and just be like, like I drew this board for Keith called the Piss Pants. I don't think it was the first, but it was probably second or third, and it was like a bad drawing of the city of San Francisco with a diaper on it, and this like bad pee drip coming out of the tip of the diaper. Like that's just horrible.
Yeah.
I did have access to
I think I remember that one.
No, you don't.
I think I do, actually.
I hope not. But again, you know, it was just to even have the opportunity when you're not that good. Like to have my shit on a rack next to Todd's and Mike Giants and Chris Cycle and Jay Noto and Doug that do Morning Breath. These were the guys I was studying, and just to be on the racks next to them was like an incredible experience, and it helped get me, eventually my stuff at Think started doing better as it stopped being so terrible. The t-shirt I did for Thrasher did okay, and like Fausto and Eric realized that I could probably go out and do something other than run their print shop. And eventually, I think Keith and Eric and Fausto all sort of together kicked that door open and pulled me out and put me in an art department, but I had never turned on a computer in my life, which in the late 90s was a dangerous art director to have. Yeah. Like, I shouldn't be doing this job. This guy, Martin Walker, this like Swiss graphic designer that we had at Think, kind of taught me how to use the computer and taught me how to use Illustrator and Photoshop. And slowly, when I started in that art department, I was one of like 6 dudes. And over the next 5 years, it literally, a guy would leave and they wouldn't replace him, and I just kind of learned to do his job and keep doing that, to a point where at one point, I was the only dude in there doing Think. It was a 6-man job that I just turned down to one guy who could barely use a computer, and I couldn't do it anymore.
Oh, man.
At some point, I moved out of there after almost a decade working for Fausto and Eric, and then eventually Keith, and you know, that was the last full-time job I had. I walked out of there and did a snowboard gig for Santa Cruz, and that led to the next gig, and that led to the next gig, and all these years later, I'm just glad to still be doing this job.
Yeah.
Enough.
Well, you know what's interesting is Fausto and Eric always gave everyone opportunities.
Yeah.
They always seen something in certain guys, and they would, even if they weren't that good at whatever it was that they did, they always gave them an opportunity. They seen something in them, and they just like, go for it. Yep. They would put people right in that hot seat, and it's like, well, I gotta do what? Like you're saying, like Dustin, when it maybe was Jet who worked there, maybe he split.
Yeah, and he was his assistant, but he didn't run the place.
Yeah, and they just threw him right in the fire.
Well, he didn't show up.
Trial by fire. Yeah, but
here's
I mean,
this whole
Dustin,
company
like,
at 24, run this.
Exactly.
And
Trial
Dustin
by fire.
stepped up and slaughtered it. I mean, he's a great dude to work with and for.
Yeah, and that's incredible, but they literally do, like, here's the frying pan.
And there's no other way to learn that than getting hired to work for a guy who you just watched literally get handed the reins of a company, and you're like, oh, that's how they do it out here?
Exactly.
Get ready.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? You never know what they're going to ask you to do.
Exactly. And that's how Think probably happened. They seen, you're like, okay,
no, definitely.
This guy.
100%. Like, they lost a guy they didn't know was going to leave, and the next thing you know, they needed somebody, and they just kind of moved chess pieces and stuck me in there.
Fish, get in there.
Exactly
this is
what
your job
happened.
now. Yeah, they kind of move people around at times. They're pretty open with that stuff, man. I love that about those guys.
To the point, they gave me a thing in Slap for about 3 or 4 years. I had my own little column in the middle of Slap called The Big Stupid. I was really good friends with Mark Whiteley, who was the editor at the time, and he kind of nudged them to get me to do it. That was the first time anybody around the world saw my stuff. And I don't know, I didn't really think about that. At that age, I was just psyched to be in Slap. Slap was like the younger brother of Thrasher, and a little bit more for my generation, just because I rode small wheels and had big pants at some point in my life and wasn't kidding. So, to have something in there where I was literally, I started getting, I think I got an email. Mark was like, you got to get an email. Like, we're getting weird people trying to contact you at the magazine. And, the internet was new.
Yeah.
I got an email and started to get emails from around the world and started to get opportunities. At the same time that I was working at Print Time, and especially at Think, I was starting to do more art shows around the city and some in Oakland.
And what year was that around?
2001, 2, 3, early 2000s was when I was doing The Big Stupid.
Yeah.
So gallery stuff was building from when I got out of school in the late 90s and into the early 2000s. I was getting, like, I got a show in Italy and like some shit where I was just like, how the fuck is this happening? But it was Slap. And it was skateboarding, and it was my relationship to skateboarding that as people were trying to expose this new sort of art scene, which got disgustingly labeled street art a lot.
Yeah.
They put skateboarding in there too to just make it not be all about graffiti. And so a lot of these early like Euro street art things I got pushed into because they're like, oh, that's the guy from California that like draws skateboard graphics and has a thing in a skateboard magazine. And a lot of the times at these art events that were like, you know, dudes from all around the world, graffiti dudes mostly, they'd be like, make the guy from skateboarding talk so like the cops don't get mad, you know? And I was just like happy to be there, you know? Like to me, to have been in San Francisco is one thing. To be halfway around the world representing San Francisco and like the sport that got me the job, fucking hell, man. I was like pretty proud of myself at that age. And like, again, as I got more and more frustrated working for Fausto and Eric and Keith, not because I didn't love the job, just because times were tough. The sport has had a lot of ups and downs, and I just happened to finally get a full-time gig in it because it was going down, so it wasn't as much money in it. They couldn't hire guys when people would quit. At the same time, the fine art thing was ramping up. Like these group shows around the world started to get more opportunities around the country. It just kind of timed just right that right as I'd put about 10 years into working for those dudes, the art thing was going, and I could do freelance illustration for skate or related companies.
Fairly seamless kind of.
Yeah. And so it was like art shows and T-shirt graphics
What year
for Upper Playground.
What year did you leave?
I think 2004. But again, I was still contributing to Slap. They let me keep it, which is fucking unheard of for those dudes. Like to walk out of Think, and not on bad terms, but I was done. You know what I mean? Like I had my stuff packed and was waiting for them to hire somebody, and they couldn't. And I, much love to Keith and those dudes, but they rang me out. I had to go try and do it on my own. And so I kept Slap, kept getting those kind of opportunities. And to be honest, all these years later, that's sort of still what I do.
I think there's so many people within our world and community and skaters alone, I mean, who have that same story in the sense of like, I don't know, I just split my house with $20 in my pocket and you know, headed west or, you know, wherever they went 3,000 miles away from home just to see if they could make it work.
Yeah.
And just, you know, couch surfed and so forth. Sometimes it's right place, right time. Sometimes it's skill related, right? Like, oh, that guy's got some skills, we could pull him in. You know, there's so many variables involved, but it seems as though skateboarders have like some magic door they walk through at some point in their life and have these people appear in our lives, right? Like Dustin, who just out of nowhere appears and gives you a job actually doing what you went to school for, that's super rare as well.
Oh man.
Like
that and like I was saying earlier, and the reason I use this story a lot to tell younger artists, like sort of follow your guts on a lot of this stuff, because I felt super guilty. Like when stuff would go down at my school, big art events and shit like that, and I was like, you know, this guy's growing to Benicia, like I'm getting in that car, you know, or like whatever.
Priorities, dude.
The number of things I ditched out on at this place where I had borrowed all this money to get this education and network with all these dudes and try and get some kind of art career going there, you know, caused me a lot of anxiety because mostly I just didn't care. Like I was really into skateboarding, and that's what Dustin and I had in common. I mean, he knew I had a screen printing resume or whatever, but we were shredding. You know what I mean? Dustin lived 2 blocks from me, and like we went skating a lot. And it's funny that at that age, it had never, ever, ever crossed my mind that was networking. Like in what, you know, that dude I went skateboarding with once or twice a week was the guy that actually changed my life and introduced me to these dudes that gave me this career. And I was networking without realizing it. So a lot of times, maybe when you think what is the responsible career move, or, you know, take advantage of this art school you're paying all this money to go to, you know, it was my social life and my true passion that kind of brought me to the gig that changed my life, not like the prescribed way of getting into art.
Yeah,
you know?
of course.
And at the same time, Juxtapose comes out, which is exactly that.
Right.
Like in '94, when I landed, that magazine started. So by the time I worked for Fausto and Eric in the print shop and we were getting to print Robert Williams and Barry McGee and all this stuff that was truly like the language that I understood as far as fine art went, it's funny how those things all just kind of got stirred into this big smoothie that I drank back then, you know?
Yeah.
I don't know, if anything, I'd like to be remembered for somebody that just kind of mixed them all together, and hell yeah.
Hold on a sec.
There's the Felper. That was sick.
Jake.
Hey Tom, how are you?
What are you doing?
Skating around?
You, no, I'm doing a BS with Jeremy Fish. He just mentioned your name literally
So we fucking turn up the camera.
1 minute ago. No, it's on.